I've been asked several times over the past few months if I might make a video on this thing called borderline personality disorder. And I have basically resisted doing it, but finally decided, I'm going to give it a shot. The main reason that I have resisted doing it, and I'm glad I'm starting this video here, is that I don't even believe there is a thing called borderline personality disorder. I don't really buy the existence of this diagnosis, this psychiatric personality disorder. I actually don't really buy any of these diagnoses because I don't believe ultimately in the concept of psychiatric diagnosis at all. I think it's way too arbitrary. It's a bunch of people arbitrarily sitting in a room deciding what are the criteria, we're going to give it this name. There's no chemical or biological tests for any of these things. There's not proof that there's a biological basis in any of them. It's just arbitrary names applied to arbitrary human behaviors. So I just want that to be my opening caveat. And that's the main reason. I don't even want to give any credence to this idea that borderline personality disorder really exists. So I'm sorry for even putting it in the title. At the same time, so many people do believe in it, do use it as a legitimate name, do believe in the diagnosis, and I even know some people who like themselves having been diagnosed with that. I know more people who don't, but this is the reason I want to give it a shot, just because it's in common parlance now. People all talk about borderline personality disorder as if it is a real thing. So in that way, I'm going to try to do my best to talk about it as if it is actually a real thing, even though on a personal level, I don't really believe it. So here goes. The first thing is borderline personality disorder has a bunch of different criteria by which a person gets diagnosed with it. And this is what I want to say. Those criteria are real. People do experience those things. People do have those constellation of behaviors that get them labeled with this arbitrary thing called borderline personality disorder. That list being, having, what is it? Let me see if I can remember them. A fear of real or perceived abandonment, really intense reactions to perceiving that they're going to be abandoned or really have been emotionally abandoned or literally abandoned by others, often in relationships and friendships. Intense mood swings, real emotional lability, emotionally up, emotionally down, often seeing things in black and white. Let me see, what's another one? They say, often intensely overvaluing someone, followed by devaluing people. So basically flipping on how you look at someone, liking them and then hating them. Self-harming behaviors seems to be common with people who end up with that diagnosis of borderline personality disorders. So cutting behaviors, things like that. Other forms of self-destructive behavior, rage, sometimes even paranoia. So basically being really very suspicious of other people, suspicious of their motives, often chronic feelings of emptiness. So feeling like there's not much in there, not feeling like necessarily a person even has a self of their own sometimes. This also can be related to people feeling like they have an unstable sense of who they are or a shifting sense of who they are. So who they are can really shift a lot of times. They can present one way sometimes and present other ways at other times. And often even their own self-image can really shift. Unstable relationships too, probably not a surprise considering some of these other qualities that get labeled as borderline. So people who have relationships that can be very, very explosive sometimes, lots of really intense love followed by really intense hatred, breakups, intense new relationships. Basically, some people who end up with this diagnosis can have real relational chaos. So these are the basic criteria. If people have several of these qualities especially, can get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Now, there are some other keys for this diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. One thing, and we learned about this way back in social work school when I was studying to become a therapist, they said, and this is a key, they said about borderline personality disorder, they said it's ego-syntonic. Most of the mental health diagnoses, major depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar, etc., generalized anxiety disorder, the list could go on. These are ego-dystonic. Borderline personality disorder is ego-syntonic. They say the same thing about narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. These are ego-syntonic. And what the difference is between ego-syntonic and ego-dystonic is how a person feels about having the symptoms, having that problem that gets labeled with the diagnosis. And the key with ego-syntonic is that it actually feels good to that person's sense of self, to their ego. They feel that it's actually a good part of them. So all those symptoms that a person with borderline personality disorder has, those are things that the person, according to psychiatry, feels good about having. Whereas when a person says, oh my God, I have the symptoms that end up getting me diagnosed with schizophrenia or major depression, they don't like it. It's ego-dystonic. It feels like it's out of sync with their personality. They say, I don't like having this. It's bad. When a person ends up diagnosed with borderline personality, they say, no, it's okay that I have this. This is who I am. This is a good thing. I'm right. It's the other people that are the problem. They're wrong. I'm actually okay. They don't see a problem with having this set of symptoms that end up diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Now, this is very interesting because what this really means in terms of the mental health system, it means in terms of giving someone this diagnosis, is the therapist or psychiatrist who does the diagnosing, who gives them this diagnosis, is saying, fundamentally, you don't even realize how sick you are. You don't even realize how troubled you are to end up doing all these things. And I'm going to give you a label that acknowledges not only that you have all these problems, but it's a problem with your fundamental personality, that you think it's okay that you're this way, but actually you're wrong. It's not okay. This is a fundamental part of your sickness, of your illness, that you think you're okay, but you're not, and I'm going to label you with something that you can't even recognize is a problem. Now, I did have to diagnose as a therapist. When I worked at clinics, it was just part of my job. I had to diagnose every single client I saw. They all had to have a psychiatric diagnosis. And primarily the reason is I had to diagnose them for insurance purposes. Insurance companies would not pay. Most of my clients, they paid with some form of insurance, and the insurance companies required that they have a psychiatric diagnosis to be billed. So I never diagnosed anyone with borderline. The main reason being 99% of people who ended up diagnosed with borderline personality disorder didn't like it. They felt it was an insult. They felt, this is a very harmful thing that's been put on me. You've just given me a very ugly label. I have this pathological label called a borderline personality. And what is it on the border between anyways? Because if it's on the border of something, is it on the border of sanity and insanity? And I think fundamentally way back when, the original idea, I remember learning this somewhere along the way, the borderline, and the idea has changed now, but the idea way back when is the borderline personality was the person who was on the border between neurosis and psychosis. They were on that border, and they could flip between psychosis and neurosis. Now, I'm going to tell you this. This is something that probably doesn't get discussed as much, but from the perspective of someone who was a therapist, I've heard some interesting statements, and really two come to mind that really jump out at me about the therapeutic attitude toward people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. The first is actually, interestingly, from a psychiatrist who I knew, and I liked her. She was a good soul, and she practiced in another state outside of New York. I don't want to get into too much details for her privacy, but what she told me is this. In another state, so it wasn't New York, where she practiced as a psychiatrist, every year she had to fill out the forms for her malpractice insurance for her private psychiatry practice. And she said they only asked one question about diagnosis on the form that she would fill out in paying for her malpractice insurance. And I know for psychiatrists, it's very, very expensive to get malpractice insurance to be a psychiatrist in case somebody sues you. For therapists, generally psychologists, social workers, it's a lot cheaper, but for psychiatrists, it's expensive. And she said there was only one question about diagnosis on her whole malpractice insurance form, and it was, what percentage of your caseload is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder? And she told me this because she found it interesting. And I remember I got it right away, what they were getting at with that. But she explained to me, she said, see, even the insurance companies are worried about what percentage of my caseload is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Because what they realize is that people diagnosed with borderline personality disorders are much more likely to end up hating their psychiatrist and ending up suing them. So from the perspective of the insurance companies, they want to know how much do they charge the psychiatrist for malpractice insurance. Because if the psychiatrist writes down, let's say 40% of my caseload is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, they're going to ramp up how much she has to pay every year for her malpractice insurance. Whereas if she only sees 5% of people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, she's going to pay much less malpractice insurance. They weren't particularly worried about what percentage of her caseload was diagnosed with bipolar or schizophrenia or OCD. They were worried about borderline personality disorder. That was the diagnosis that was the big fear. And I remembered that. And I thought, very interesting. Now another one, this was told to me by a therapist I was friends with. When I asked him, what's the deal? Right when I became a therapist, I asked this therapist I was friends with, who'd been a therapist for like 25 or 30 years. I said, what's the deal with this borderline personality disorder? I'm not really into this diagnosis. It just seems like another way to insult people. And what he told me was, he says, you want to know the most interesting thing I ever heard about borderline personality disorder? I said, what? He said, actually, this comes from a newspaper. He said he read it in a newspaper article, and it was quoted by some different therapist. Sorry. Sounds like there's an ambulance outside. Ironic or not? Huh. But anyway, he told me that in the newspaper, there was a newspaper article where they were interviewing a therapist, and they asked some therapist, not my friend, but another guy in the newspaper, they said, what do you think borderline personality disorder is? And he said, this is what the therapist said. I never saw the article, so I can't quote it myself. But he said, this therapist said, a person with borderline personality disorder is the client who calls you up repeatedly at 2 o'clock in the morning threatening to commit suicide, and you know they'll never do it, but you kind of wish they would. And I thought, whoa. Now, what he also told me is he heard afterward that the therapist who got quoted for saying that got in a lot of trouble for saying that. Now, why did they get in trouble for saying that? Mostly because it really shows the therapeutic disdain that so many therapists have, not just for clients, but especially for clients with this particular diagnosis. And actually, behind the scenes, I have heard a lot of therapists behave that way. They said to me, oh, that person's diagnosed with borderline. I don't want to work with borderlines. Oh, I don't want to work with cluster B personalities. I don't want to work with people with axis 2 pathology. Oh, they never get better. That's the attitude. They never get better. Well, now there's all this stuff about people going to DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, the therapy of choice for people with borderline personality disorder, et cetera, et cetera. And I know some people who've been in DBT and they say it's helped them. I know some people who say it hasn't helped them. Some people say, oh, it's great, and you learn structure and you learn all sorts of things about how to regulate your emotions better and blah, blah, blah. And I heard some people say, it's just a bunch of crap. It didn't help me at all. But I want to get into what I really think about borderline personality disorder. What did I tell people when they came in? Because I had clients who would come in, I've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. I'm embarrassed to have this diagnosis. I don't want to tell my friends. Some woman might say, I just went on a date with a guy, and I don't want to tell him that I'm diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Yeah, maybe I have had some of those criteria, but it just feels like an insult. It hurts, it's shameful, it's like a lot of stigma. And I do agree, there can be a huge amount of stigma attached to having the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. So from the perspective of a therapist, what I believe is stigma, having the stigma of this diagnosis in no way helps someone recover from the problems that get labeled with this diagnosis. And I would tell this to a client. I might say, yeah, actually, you have even described that you have some of these criteria. But I'm not into this diagnosis. And I don't think diagnosis should be something that actually hurts someone in recovering. I don't think it should be something that hurts someone in their healing process. I think it should be something, if anything, that is helpful or neutral. So one thing I see again and again, and I would tell this to people, is if you look at somebody's life, there's always different ways to give a diagnosis or to assess a person's problem. And what I found again and again and again, maybe there were some exceptions, but not very many, is that the people who got diagnosed with borderline personality disorder just as easily qualified for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. If you go through and read the criteria for getting diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, it was just a different lens at looking at the person's problems. And this also highlights something that's a little bit of an aside, that when therapists diagnosed people with borderline personality disorder, I found this again and again, and I've heard therapists even say this. Some therapists who are more enlightened agree with me on this, that by diagnosing someone with borderline personality disorder, largely what the therapist is subliminally saying to the client is, I don't like you, and I don't think I can help you. And now I'm going to give you a diagnosis that is going to make it clear that when I don't help you because I don't like you and I'm not really that much fundamentally on your side, at least I have some way out for defending myself for why you didn't change, why you didn't get better. Because you now have this diagnosis that basically stigmatizes you and says you're impossible to work with. Now, what I found is if a therapist really does empathize with a client much more, empathize with what they went through as a child, empathize with their life struggles, they're going to be much less likely to diagnose them with borderline personality disorder. They're going to be much more likely to diagnose them with something like post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I'm actually not even into the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and I've talked about that in at least one or two other videos. The main reason I don't like the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder is I don't see it as a disorder. The fundamental idea behind post-traumatic stress disorder, in its definition, is that the person is having all these post-traumatic reactions, a syndrome, to having been traumatized that is beyond what would be expected of a normal person who went through those very traumas. So if a more normal person went through those traumas, they would be reacting in a more healthy way. But a person with post-traumatic stress disorder is reacting in a disordered way to their trauma. So they're reacting in a way that's too extreme. That's why I don't fundamentally like the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, because inherently in that diagnosis, it too is insulting. It says you're reacting in a crazy way beyond what's expected because of the horrible things you went through. I much prefer saying you're traumatized. You went through horrible things. You're having a very natural and normal and ordered and expected response to that trauma. You have PTS. You have post-traumatic stress. What you're going through is normal, but unfortunately the mental health field, psychiatry, the diagnostic system doesn't allow you to diagnose someone, even with an extreme post-traumatic reaction, to just having post-traumatic stress. You have to give them the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And most mental health professionals, most people in the world, they forget that whole part of the disorder, or perhaps they never knew it in the first place, the idea that it's a pathological response, that your response to this trauma is pathological when you diagnose someone with PTSD. However, compared to the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, PTSD, even in its definition, is much less insulting. It's much less offensive. Basically, there at least shows some empathy for the client, saying, well, you had horrible things happen to you and you're having a reaction to it, as opposed to just saying, if you read the criteria for the definition of borderline personality disorder, they're not talking about what happened to the person. They're not looking into the etiology of what happened to the person. They're just saying you're displaying horrible, stressful, out of control, borderline crazy behavior. So what I would tell my clients again and again is, let's change your diagnosis. Let's bill for something else. What would you prefer? Do you like post-traumatic stress disorder? Lots of people, by the way, also, who ended up with the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and not surprisingly, were depressed, because those kind of life characteristics, those kind of behaviors often lead people, at least intermittently, to have a pretty depressing life. So basically, what I could say is there's lots of other diagnoses that are less insulting than borderline, than a therapist can give somebody. So right away, if a therapist is going around diagnosing lots of people with borderline personality disorder, it's a real question. What's in the mind of this therapist? Are they really out to help people? Generally, I question it. Giving someone a personality disorder, even if they qualify for it, it's generally not a nice thing. But anyway, to really look at the psychology of the criteria that people have that end up getting them diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, these things all can result from trauma. Why would someone have an unstable sense of themselves? They were traumatized when their self was developing. They were attacked. They were violated. They didn't have people respect their boundaries. So many people who I talked to who ended up diagnosed with borderline personality disorder were sexually abused, often in horrendous ways, and often by the people who were supposed to love them the most in their lives, their parents. I've heard so many women with borderline personality disorders who were molested by their fathers. That is common. And even therapists talk about it. They say, oh, borderline, yeah, someone probably had some really shitty stuff happen to them. So another one, suspiciousness. Oh, someone's very suspicious. They don't trust other people. Well, that's a result of trauma also. When people don't trust other people, the reason they don't trust other people is not because they were born with a disordered personality. It's that they learned along the way that people are often not trustworthy. And when people get abused and violated and failed profoundly by people in their primary relationships, they learn people aren't trustworthy. And what's the cure for that? A big part of the cure is learning to trust people again. And the way to trust people again is to find people who are trustworthy and to build long-standing, healthy, structured, trusting relationships where people aren't going to fail them, where people who aren't going to do things that betray them. So part of what I think is if you're going to diagnose someone with a diagnosis that actually is kind of a societal betrayal, a stigma, a black spot on your head, that in and of itself could be considered another trauma. That is another way of just rejecting someone. So another reason for me not to ever diagnose someone with borderline personality disorder if they already are displaying the characteristics of not really trusting people too well. What better wonderful way to start a therapeutic relationship with someone if you are required to diagnose them than by saying, well, let's build a relationship based on trust. And let's say, I think you should have some input into how you are diagnosed. Would you prefer to be diagnosed with something like PTSD or maybe a generalized anxiety disorder? You certainly qualify for having a lot of anxiety. Or maybe you could be called someone with dysthymia. You have a lot of, ongoing depression in your life, something like that. And a lot of people, what I found, almost actually everybody I ever talked to who hated their diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, which is most of the people who I met who are diagnosed with it, who came to me, they said, yeah, let's change it. And guess what? A therapist has the power to say, in the first session, or at least many therapists, I had that power, change their diagnosis. Let's bill for something different. And it would work. So that for me was the quickest cure for borderline. Let's just remove it and give you a different diagnosis. Switching diagnoses. Now what about some of the other ones? Self-harm. What could cause someone to want to harm themselves? Well, from what I've heard, from people who harm themselves again and again, who display all sorts of different types of self-destructive behavior, is that they learned that along the way. That, first of all, they were harmed. People harmed them. People in their primary relationships often harmed them profoundly. Life harmed them. Friends harmed them. Authority figures harmed them. And what they learned is, if I can harm myself in different ways, then I can actually take control of this process, and I can do this in a way of controlling my feelings. My feelings are coming out all over the place. And what I've heard from people when they cut themselves, things like that, that actually, yes, it might physically hurt, but emotionally it can help them control their feelings. It can help them push their feelings down. I would say sometimes it helps people dissociate. But for some people, when they're in extreme emotional overload, when their feelings are flying out, cutting themselves can cause people to bring their emotions back into control. I would consider it a very maladaptive way of coping with life's pain. I think there's lots of other healthy ways of coping with pain, especially if the end result is the person just dissociates. Dissociation being another consequence of trauma. I think much better, especially for people who end up diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, is to use therapy as a place to build toward their own personal grieving process, to grieve their losses. And that's what I've seen again and again with people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. A huge history in their life of losses. Losses of people, losses of love, losses of wonderful things that were in their life, losses of parts of themselves. Loss, 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 loss. A graveyard of losses in their life. sad life, a painful life usually. A lot of very difficult things that have happened. And to me, I speak about this in my own personal life, I've lost a lot. How do I cope with my losses? How do I deal with my losses? How do I heal from my losses? How do I regain my sense of self? What I've seen in myself and what I've seen in others, the answer to this, whether it's mild losses or extreme losses, lots of mild losses, lots of extreme losses, is to grieve, is to look at what happened, is to begin to make sense of it, is to reclaim the feelings, the blocked sadness, the blocked hurt, the blocked anger. Oh, borderline personality disorder, they say. These are people with so much anger. They have anger that just erupts. Well, people who are traumatized have this also. A lot of blocked anger that doesn't always come out in the healthiest way, but that anger itself is legitimate. This anger is fuel for the fire of healing. This is fuel for the energy of the healing process. That anger is a good thing. It just has to be directed in a healthy way. Also, what I've seen, people diagnosed with borderline personality a lot of times have very shaky boundaries in their interpersonal relationships with other people. Now, part of what that is they didn't learn healthy boundaries when they grew up. They were with people who had bad boundaries. Their boundaries were violated. They weren't allowed to have their feelings. And having a good, healthy sense of self is one of the best ways to have boundaries. And one thing is to have appropriate anger. Now, what I've seen, what I've heard from people who have borderline personality disorder again and again and again, is when they were children, so many of them weren't allowed to have their appropriate anger. So one thing is they were violated, they were traumatized, and when they started having their angry responses, normal, healthy, angry responses to being violated in all sorts of different ways, they also secondarily weren't allowed to have their anger. So they have a very confusing relationship with anger. Their anger, on top of everything else, was pathologized. And yet they still intuitively want to have their anger. At some level, they know their anger is healthy, but they never learned how to deal with it in a healthy way because they weren't allowed to have it. So when they grow up into adult life, their anger doesn't always come out in the healthiest ways. And this can make interpersonal relationships with other people very shaky, very confusing, lots of eruptions. So add that into people who are terrified of being abandoned because they've been abandoned so many times in their life and they have anger, it makes it difficult to have healthy, stable relationships. So what I've seen as a therapist is people who have gone through this, no matter what their diagnosis, PTSD or borderline or whatever the diagnosis is, but people who have these personality criteria, characteristics, they need to learn to respect what they've gone through, first of all, and to recognize what are the healthy responses to anybody who goes through those things. It's normal to have anger. It's normal to have sadness. It's normal to have hatred for people who did that. So part of it is actually placing the blame on the people who did it. Now, realizing the bad things that happened to someone may have happened 20 years ago. So to feel that for people who did it back then, but to not necessarily transfer it to modern people in their modern relationships. The modern people in their life may not be deserving of all that rage, all that anger, all that sadness, or pulling away, terror of abandonment, so abandoning people first. And I think it can really help people to start to get in touch with their traumas, to make sense of it, to realize, actually, no, they're not really crazy at all. Their behavior, their modern behavior might come across as crazy, might even be a little bit crazy, but fundamentally, it has a root that has a purpose that is healthy. It's all us striving for healing. And that's another reason, I think I'll close with this, why I'm just so against that diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And I kind of said it, but I'll say it again. That diagnosis is not a diagnosis that lends hope toward people healing. So for me, if someone gets that diagnosis, I'd say, if you really want to help someone heal as a therapist, there's so many other ways to do it without having to label them borderline. And the second thing is, I do want to acknowledge that for people who are in relationships with people who get that diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, it can be incredibly stressful, even very unpleasant. Often, People like that are not the people we necessarily want to get into the most close, intimate relationships with. And why? Because this is getting in close, intimate relationships with people who have a lot of unresolved trauma, and often a lot of extreme unresolved trauma. This has nothing to do with borderline. This has to do with people who have been very harmed, who haven't worked out a lot of it yet. So for me, I guess what I think fundamentally is it's really about perspective on looking at someone, or looking at oneself if you have that diagnosis, and having compassion for what we went through, what they went through, maybe even what we all went through to varying degrees, and realize that the healing process is about acknowledging that and grieving those losses. It might take a long, long time, but to me, ultimately, grieving the losses, acknowledging the losses, making sense of them, and reclaiming ourselves is the way to heal from all those fundamental problems.